Hello and welcome to week 13 of government class. 13 already. Up until this point, we've been looking at the U.S. government and the way we've drawn up this government and the way it operates in terms of how it interacts with us domestically, we as citizens. This week, we're going to look at this system of government and how it interacts with foreign nations, with other governments. I keep saying I'm not going to go 50 minutes on these, and I don't think I've got enough beef to go 50 minutes today. So if we don't, that's cool. But there are a couple of very fair questions that I want you to kind of debate in your heads as we go along, determining what the U.S. should or should not do in terms of other nations. Again, not us. This is how we deal with other people. The United States plays a major role in the community of nations. This will consider this topic, look at the idea behind our relations, advantages, disadvantages, the role of the United Nations and our relationship with them, and just basically a look at how this great government of ours, which really has been groundbreaking in terms of world history, how does it interact, or how does it compel us to interact with others? A key factor in the American victory in the Revolutionary War was recognition and support from the nation of France. We were at war with the King of Great Britain. France and England were very much rivals at the time, really the two world superpowers. And having France on our side legitimized these colonists, these rebels who had the audacity to challenge the King of England. So the recognition from France, the diplomatic recognition and the very real material support, military support that they sent with Lafayette and others, was a major factor in not only winning the war, but legitimizing this new government. If you'll recall, 70 years after that, the Confederate States of America, in their Civil War, tried desperately to get France and Britain to recognize them. Their thought was, since both countries relied so heavily on the cotton produced in the South, that they would recognize them. It's more than just recognizing and say, hey, you're the Confederacy. It's a formal declaration that, yes, you are a nation. You have the right to exist, and I recognize that, and thereby I'm going to treat you as a sovereign nation. Now, for the Confederate States, that would have been huge. You can make a great argument that the primary reason the Confederate Army went into Gettysburg was to try and impress France and England, try to demonstrate that their military had the capability of winning a battle on foreign soil. They did not win, and that recognition, of course, never came. Had it come, I believe U.S. history would have been very, very different. But that just underscores the importance of diplomacy and that very basic idea of recognizing, recognizing formally another nation's very existence. Now, in the United States, the way we have it set up, the president is seen as both head of state and head of government. Makes sense. The president appoints one of his cabinet positions as Secretary of State. And by that, this is the person who leads all U.S. efforts overseas. Our first Secretary of State, perhaps you've heard of him, a fellow named Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson had already established great relationships with France and by proxy other countries, so he was a natural pick to be the first Secretary of State of this brand new nation. Secretary of State is the main diplomat. He is the negotiator, or she. We've had two female Secretaries of State lately. Madeleine Albright, I think, was the first. They are the lead negotiator with other nations. They are recognized as peacekeepers. They are recognized as deal makers. Secretary of State, again, for the United States, if they're going to uphold the ideals that we hold for ourselves, then they are going to seek peace above all. We have diplomats, ambassadors is the highest ranking diplomat in each foreign nation. Pretty much almost every other country in the world, we have a diplomatic presence. In most of them, we have an embassy, an actual building where the ambassador and his staff work from. And it's real weird. Embassies are considered the sovereign territory of the other country. You bounce around Washington, D.C., there are embassies from dozens of other countries, and technically, if you step off the streets of D.C. and step on their property, you're on foreign soil. That's the way diplomatic relations are extended. There's a whole lot of diplomatic immunity is a thing, other than a plot device in Lethal Weapon movies. It is a thing. And if the president will often have a plum appointment for friends to be ambassador to a nation that we're friendly with. I don't even know who the U.S. ambassador to Canada is, but whoever he is, he's got 4 years off. We're in great relationship with Canada. That's not going to be a job that's busy. Our ambassador to France is bored. That's a plum job. Our ambassador to Saudi Arabia is a busy man. That's because while we have relations with Saudi Arabia, they're very rocky at times. That ambassador is more than just shining a stool with his butt. He is busy. He is trying to assert U.S. positions with the Saudi government while at the same time being very tactful and recognizing that this is an uneasy alliance at best. So yeah, if you're an ambassador, where you are determines how busy you are. Countries can sometimes use this idea of diplomatic recognition for their own political advantage. In the late 1800s, the United States purchased from France the rights to a canal that was being built along the length of Panama, which would allow ships to basically cut their travel time from the Atlantic to Pacific in half. They wouldn't have to sail around South America. They'd go through the Panama Canal. All right, so we bought the canal and its right-of-way from France. At the time, the land was in the nation of Colombia. And for various reasons, the U.S. and Colombia were not getting along very well. Colombia was putting a lot of demands on what the U.S. excavators were doing there. Fortunately for the U.S., a lot of the people who lived around the general vicinity of the canal had been thinking about breaking away from the government of Colombia. So they did. The U.S. recognized the nation of Panama and helped them in their independence efforts. So, in this case, U.S. diplomatic recognition created a new country, which, of course, they were much friendlier with. So we didn't have very many problems with Panama after, we helped them gain their independence. We formally recognized Russia in 1933, or the Soviet Union, of course. It leads to one of those questions that I'm going to ask you. If another nation is doing bad things to their citizens, to others, should the U.S. maintain diplomatic relations? Now, there's two schools of thought here. If you want to influence their behavior, you can do it better as a friend than as an enemy. But on the other hand, if you remain a friend, then are you endorsing the activity that you don't like? Think about that. I'll ask you in class Monday about that, because, again, that's one of those. There's no right answer to that, just so you'll know. But I just want to know where you think, because, again, that's one of the very delicate balancing acts that we have to play as a nation when we look at the concept of diplomacy. Another diplomacy makes odd bedfellows thing. For years, the United States supported the Shah of Iran, who was basically their king. Shah was deposed in 1979. Maybe you've heard about this in history books. I lived through it. The embassy was taken over in Tehran, and 50 Americans were held hostage for over a year. During that time, the nation of Iraq had other issues with Iran and attacked them. And so a war began between Iraq and Iran. Even though we had had rocky relations with Iraq to that point, guess who we supported? Iraq. We gave them a whole lot of stuff, and in the process, we helped a young, ambitious dictator named Saddam Hussein take power. Diplomatic decisions ripple for many, many years. That's why you have to be careful. It seems like a good idea at the time. It may be the right idea for the time, but will it be for all time? Very quickly on the idea of trade. There's a whole chapter in your book devoted to it. I'm going to try to skim over it a little bit. The idea of trade is, I got something you want, you got something I want, let's make a deal. That's the basics for trade. Anybody can understand that. Where it gets complicated is making the deal. I think my stuff is more valuable than the stuff I'm getting from you. Therefore, I demand you give me 2 of yours for 1 of mine. No, you say, I don't think it's that much of a difference. I'll give you 3 of mine for 2 of yours. And so it begins. Suffice to say that when we're talking about international trade, that is to say the U.S. sending products made in the U.S. to China, and China sending products made in China back to the U.S., it gets very, very, very complicated. There are formulas, there are exceptions, there are taxes, there are excises, there are tariffs, and there are people who spend their entire lives dedicated to trade balances because it is such a complicated thing. Because it's so complicated, I'm not going to dive too much into it. I mean, we're not here to look at international trade policy, although to recognize that it is a major, major function of the United States government to make trade deals with other nations, to impose tariffs on their products. The 2 extremes are free trade and heavily restricted trade. No tariffs versus lots of tariffs. Again, the truth is somewhere in the middle, and we always operate somewhere in the middle, but we do have free trade agreements with other nations. NAFTA, which you've probably heard that acronym quite a lot, North American Free Trade Agreement, is a trade agreement with no tariffs between U.S., Canada, and Mexico. In our area, it meant the loss, of a lot of textile jobs. It set up provisions whereby United States textile companies, some of which were headquartered in Danville, would have been foolish not to build their plants in Mexico. And they did. And we lost a lot of jobs. Again, trade agreements, much like diplomatic recognition, can have long-term impacts, negative impacts. And again, as we debate the morality of extending diplomatic relations with nations who do bad things, so too do we debate the idea of trading with nations who do bad things, particularly China. It is an open secret that China cheats on trade deals. They are notorious for skipping around U.S. restrictions on Chinese products. Of course, items can be produced at a Chinese factory for a fraction of the cost that they can in an American factory. However, we Americans have become addicted to the low-price items that are produced in China. So if the U.S. government took too punitive an action against China, all of a sudden we couldn't go to Walmart and buy all these electronic gizmos for a bargain price. And so the U.S. consumer would revolt then. You see where it gets complicated, not only in terms of the formulas used for determining trade, but also in the morality. Extending trade with another nation is the same as granting them that oh so precious diplomatic recognition. It is, in its own way, an endorsement. Hey, I'm still willing to trade with you. Again, even if the nation is cheating us, there is still pressure to continue trade. And again, we will always be debating how big a tariff should we have on that, because the U.S. generates revenue on that. Also, tariffs can prove as a disincentive. If you are a U.S. manufacturer of widgets and China can bring in widgets at half price, you're going to want a protectionist trade policy. You're going to want the U.S. to impose duties and tariffs on Chinese widgets coming into America. So your widgets being sold at Walmart for $1 aren't sitting alongside Chinese widgets being sold at Walmart for 50 cents. Makes sense, right? Again, trade can be a very, very complicated business, not only mathematically but morally. But for the purpose of government, just understand one of the primary functions of the United States government in terms of the way it deals with other nations is in trade agreements. It is complicated. It exists, and it's worth our attention. Your book also devotes an entire chapter to terrorism, and I'm going to kind of gloss over that because, again, dealing with terrorism is just one function of our government when it comes to overseas criminal activity. The United States gives support to the World Court in The Hague. There's Interpol, the International Police Force, that again the FBI and CIA can give support to, but we're usually very reluctant with doing that. Terrorism, of course, in terms of being a criminal act, it is a global criminal act. So therefore, we have discerned that it is a proper role of government to extend some of the United States resources to other countries to help in the battle against terrorism. Immediately after the 9/11 attacks, and again, it freaks me out to no end to know that some of you were not even born when the 9/11 attacks occurred. I think Josh might have been an infant, but anyway, that having been said, it's fresh in the minds of old farts like me. We adjusted U.S. governmental policy to deal with what we saw as a threat of terrorism. Because the nation of Afghanistan's government was giving direct aid to the terrorists, the very terrorists that did this, we felt compelled to overthrow that government in Afghanistan. We did. Unfortunately, it's complicated, it's messy when you get involved in other nations' affairs. That's another part of diplomacy. Being involved with another nation is messy. You got to play by their rules. The people of that nation are not going to listen to you. They're going to listen to their leaders. Best you can do as a foreign nation is to begin a relationship with their leaders. If somebody else invaded the U.S., we would not listen to them. We wouldn't care about them. Again, it's very complicated. We see things from our side because it's our side. The other nations don't see it from our side. They see us as the enemy. So if we're going to make headway in terms of exporting American values to other nations, we've got to do it at the leadership level first. Quite frankly, there are some nations that are not ready for a representative democracy. And personally, I don't think it's our role to force it upon anyone who's not willing to take it. Another thing that happened in the wake of the 9/11 attacks is we gave up a lot of our personal liberties. Have you heard of the Patriot Act? Patriot Act was passed by Congress in the emotional aftermath of 9/11 to give U.S. agencies broad surveillance powers. They can now legally collect any piece of information on you. They store it, allegedly, in what's called metadata form. That is to say, any surveillance information they store and they keep it over here without looking at it. But if they need to go look at it, there it is. And they don't need a warrant for that. We surrendered a whole lot of liberty in the name of safety there. Does that sound familiar? Does that sound like what some people are doing during a pandemic? When you're scared, you're not thinking straight. When you're scared, you are willing to do just about anything to feel safe. A generation ago, Americans, at least enough of them, were scared enough to give away a whole lot of their individual liberty. The thing is, it's not individual liberty that you see every day. It's not the individual liberty that comes with freedom of expression, freedom of religion, Second Amendment. It's not tangible. But before the Patriot Act, we had the right to have our personal information protected from the government unless a judge issued a warrant specifically for that case, for us. We gave that up because we were scared. Think about that. Think about what we're giving up today because some people are scared. Diplomatic decisions have long-lasting impacts. Trade decisions have long-lasting impacts. Crime fighting, international crime fighting decisions have long-term impacts. Just think about that. The fourth lesson of the unit focuses on the United Nations, and it gives us a chance to think about some other government efforts, again, in terms of the United States, in that George Washington, in his first inaugural address, the very first president of this nation, warned against what he called permanent political alliances. Made sense. We, of course, as we mentioned earlier, had just been recognized by France in order to defeat Britain. Washington cautioned against the idea of permanently being beholden to France. And as it turned out, just a few years later, we darn near got in a war with France over what we called Northwest Territory rights. We got into another war with England a few years later. George Washington knew that so-called permanent relationships were a bad idea because things change. Things change. Now, as much as we were at odds with Great Britain and France in the late 18th century, we're now high allies with them. Things change. Politics and diplomacy make for strange bedfellows sometimes. My enemy's enemy is my friend, even if I don't particularly like them. That's been U.S. diplomatic policy for some time. The UN was preceded by something called the League of Nations. It was formed in the wake of World War I. President Woodrow Wilson of the United States was one of the main drivers behind its formation. Insofar as, again, because so many different nation states were at war in World War I, and there were some complicated alliances there, the idea was if we could have a one world, not a governing body, but a diplomatic body, it might soothe some things out. The United States never became a league. Congress, again, Senate has to ratify any presidential treaties, and we never signed the Treaty of Versailles, which ended World War I and created the League of Nations. Because the U.S., a major player, was not involved in the League of Nations, it didn't really have any teeth, and it dissolved after really only a few years. After World War II, same idea. This is a world war. Half the globe that we know of participated. We need some type of international governing body. So we created the United Nations. This time the United States did sign on this effort. The United Nations headquarters is in New York. Their purpose is sometimes nebulous, but the idea is to have a entity where diplomats from other nations can gather and can negotiate, can deal, and can have some teeth to punish if necessary. Usually, the UN's punishment is nothing more than a strongly worded condemnation. There have been instances, though, where UN peacekeepers were brought into the fray. The Korean War was never a war. It was a UN action. The Persian Gulf War, from 30 years ago, was never a war. It was a UN action. Now, the United Nations did give the U.S. some cover to confront Russia diplomatically in the Cuban Missile Crisis. And, of course, we used the United Nations to make allies to invade Iraq in the Persian Gulf War in 1990-91. So the United States has used the United Nations for good purposes, but unfortunately, we, the United States, are far and away the largest contributor of money and resources to the United Nations. And sometimes it seems like the United Nations' only purpose is to tell the United States how bad we are. Hard to give money to a group of people that sees you so dimly. The relationship between the U.S. and the UN is complicated. Because we are the world's only superpower, it does not benefit us to give up that power for a collective body such as the UN. For anyone who's not a superpower, it sounds like a great idea to make the U.S. obey whatever the United States says. Think about that. Think about that relationship. Who has the most to gain from UN participation? Who has the most to lose from UN participation? So much of what we do overseas as a government, as the United States government, is to advance our view of human rights. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. Among these are the rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That is the foundation, the moral foundation of the United States government. And in many cases, we are trying to export that foundation to other nations. Certainly, we need to be concerned if China or any other nation is grossly violating these human rights. But what do we do? How far are we willing to go to export these very basic values to other people? JFK said, "When one is abused, we are all abused." Is that true? If the government of Benin is abusing a segment of their population, is that something we, collectively as the U.S., should be concerned about? Should we send a delegation over there? Should we send troops over there? And there are many, many nations that are actively violating the human rights of others. What is our role there? Do we send diplomats everywhere? Do we cut off communication with that nation, which sometimes strengthens dictators? Do we send armed forces over there, which sometimes makes the local populace angry? Whether or not we're trying to protect them, they see us as invaders. That's happened. Vietnam, the Balkans, Iraq. It's tricky. There is no book that tells you, here's when you bring the troops in, here's when you don't, here's when you bring the diplomats in, here's when you don't, here's when you ignore, and here's when you engage. It's a very complicated question, and we will forever be debating it. That question, and answering that question, has led to some great triumphs, but it has also led to some anguish. Again, the anguish of the Vietnam War. It's very, very difficult. Now, of course, the impetus behind the Vietnam War was sort of that larger concern of the 40s, 50s, and 60s of the free world versus the communist world. We were trying to stop what President Johnson called the domino effect of communism taking over Southeast Asia. That was the impetus behind Vietnam. But again, the larger impetus was, we believe a free nation better protects basic human rights. Therefore, we're willing to engage militarily in this tiny little country on the South Asian peninsula in order to advance our view of human rights. Noble goal. How could we as Americans think it is anything but noble to try to extend our basic human rights to other people, to prevent the bad guys from winning? The United Nations passed a Declaration of Human Rights many years ago. Unfortunately, it has no teeth. Fortunately, it has no teeth. You want to know why, fortunately? Because the UN quite often is influenced by nations who are some of the biggest human rights violators out there. The fact that the nation of Iran is on the UN Security Council tells you all you need to know about the UN Security Council. We'll debate that a little bit in class on Monday. It's a hard move. We've talked about how tricky diplomacy can be, how tricky trade can be, how tricky battling terrorism can be, how tricky supporting human rights can be. It's plenty complicated enough to try to advance those notions here within the United States. It is endlessly more complicated when you're using those values to deal with other nations. Think about that before we get into class on Monday. When is enough enough? What is enough? When do we break off connections? If you're trying to convince a friend to stop drinking, for instance, sometimes they need a pat on the back. Sometimes they need a kick in the rear. Sometimes they need you to ignore them. What's the right move? I hope you can appreciate how complicated this is. I'm going to be much shorter this week. We're right at 30 minutes. Soak all this in. We will talk more in class Monday. I am looking for good discussion from you. I'm going to be presenting some scenarios to you, and I want to hear you defend them. I want to hear you what you would do if you were king of the U.S., even though we don't have kings. Anyway, have a great weekend. We'll see you first thing Monday.